March 1946. Yokohama Harbor, Japan. ***. The wind carried ash and salt across the ruins. Where department stores once gleamed with lacquered signs and silk banners, only skeletal frames remained, black teeth against a gray sky. The war had ended 6 months earlier, but its afterimage still burned in every direction. Collapsed factories, gutted schoolhouses, neighborhoods reduced to charcoal and memory. In the streets, women walked with heads bowed, children clutched at their mothers' sleeves, and old men sat silent on rubble piles, staring at nothing. Hunger had become a language everyone spoke fluently. Then, on a Tuesday morning, something impossible appeared. At the edge of what had once been Yamashita Park, American soldiers erected a row of field kitchens. Steam rose from enormous steel vats, carrying with it an aroma that stopped people mid-step, rich, meaty, almost obscene in its abundance. Vegetables. Real vegetables. The smell of onions and carrots and something else, something the civilians couldn't immediately name because they hadn't encountered it in years. Fat. Actual rendered fat, thick and nourishing, the kind that coats the tongue and promises survival. By noon, a line had formed. Not the orderly queue of pre-war Japan, where citizens stood in neat rows awaiting their ration of sweet potato vines and millet. This line was hesitant, shambling, composed of people who had learned to distrust promises. They came anyway, driven by a hunger that had gnawed through ideology, through pride, through everything except the body's insistence on continuing. At the front of the line, a soldier ladled soup into tin bowls. He was young, maybe 22, with Kansas dust still in his vowels and a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He didn't ask questions. He didn't require loyalty oaths or work certificates. He simply filled the bowl, handed it over, and said, "Next." To understand what happened in those soup lines, to grasp why elderly men wept into their bowls and why mothers pressed the warm tin to their cheeks before drinking, you must first understand what Japan had been told about America and what Japan had told itself. For 15 years, the imperial government had crafted a narrative of American degeneracy. The United States was portrayed as a nation without soul, a mongrel empire of jazz and gangsters, where individualism had rotted the social fabric and material wealth had replaced spiritual purity. Japanese schoolchildren learned that Americans were soft, dependent on machines and luxury, incapable of the sacrifice that defined the Yamato spirit. The enemy was rich, yes, but that richness was proof of weakness, a civilization that had traded honor for convenience, duty for comfort. This narrative served a purpose. It explained why resource-poor Japan could challenge the industrial titan across the Pacific. It wasn't about steel production or oil reserves. It was about spirit versus matter, discipline versus decadence. Japanese soldiers were told they fought for something transcendent: the emperor, the race, the divine mission to liberate Asia from Western corruption. American soldiers, they were assured, fought only for paychecks and Coca-Cola. Even as the war turned, as Saipan fell and Okinawa burned, the propaganda intensified. Radio broadcasts described American barbarity, the rape of occupied territories, the planned extermination of the Japanese people. Citizens were instructed to resist invasion with bamboo spears if necessary, to die honorably rather than submit to the beast. Mothers were given cyanide capsules for their children. The message was clear: capture meant horror beyond imagining. Then the bombs fell. Hiroshima on August 6th, a flash that turned sand to glass. Nagasaki 3 days later. The emperor's voice crackled over the radio, the first time most Japanese had heard it, and announced the unthinkable: surrender. The war was over. The divine wind had failed. The undefeated empire had been defeated. In the weeks that followed, many Japanese waited for the promised atrocities. They hid their daughters. They buried family heirlooms. They prepared for slavery, for execution, for whatever nightmare occupied nations endured. Some committed suicide rather than face the conquerors. But the conquerors arrived with soup. The first elderly man to receive a bowl on that February morning was named Tanaka Hiroshi. Before the war, he had been a literature teacher, a man who spent his evenings reading Soseki and debating the merits of Western modernism with colleagues over sake. The military years had stripped him of such luxuries. First his books were burned for their dangerous foreign influence, then his school was converted to a munitions workshop, then his 2 sons were conscripted, then the American bombers came and took his house, his wife, and his reason to believe in any kind of order. He approached the soup line because his body demanded it, though his mind still recoiled from accepting charity from the enemy. He had been taught that to accept such a thing was to betray the war dead, to spit on the sacrifices made in the emperor's name. But the body, he discovered, had its own politics. Hunger was a democracy that overruled every ideology. The American soldier handed him the bowl. Tanaka-san expected contempt, perhaps mockery. He had been told Americans were arrogant victors who would humiliate the defeated. Instead, the soldier's face showed only tired professionalism, the expression of a man completing a task. "Careful," the soldier said through an interpreter. "It's hot." Tanaka-san carried the bowl to a low wall and sat. Steam rose into his face. He looked down at the contents. Chunks of beef, real beef, floating among potatoes and carrots and cabbage. There was bread on the side, white bread, soft and absurdly light. He lifted the bowl to his lips and drank. The taste struck him like a physical blow. Not just because it was food. He had eaten bark and grass and things that weren't food at all during the final months of war, but because of what the food represented. This wasn't survival rations. This wasn't the thin gruel of military efficiency. This was abundance so casual it bordered on waste. The Americans were feeding their enemies better than Japan had fed its own soldiers. He thought of his sons. The eldest had written from the Philippines about rations reduced to handfuls of rice, about eating leather belts and tree roots. The youngest had died at Iwo Jima, though the letter had only said, "honorably fulfilled his duty," which was how the military said starvation or dysentery or any of the undramatic deaths that claimed more men than combat. Neither of his boys had tasted beef in their final years. Neither had been granted even this enemy's mercy. Tanaka-san's hands shook. The bowl tilted, and soup spilled down his chin. He didn't wipe it away. He simply sat on the broken wall, weeping, while around him hundreds of his countrymen made the same discovery. The enemy had food to spare, and they were giving it away. The soup lines were not an act of isolated charity. They were part of a calculated program, ordered by General Douglas MacArthur and implemented by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. The logic was both humanitarian and strategic. A starving population was an unstable population, vulnerable to radicalization, disease, and social collapse. If Japan was to be rebuilt as a peaceful democracy, its people first needed to survive. But the execution of this logic revealed something the Japanese propaganda had never prepared its citizens for. American institutional generosity operated at a scale beyond personal virtue. It wasn't that individual soldiers were kind, though some were. It was that the system itself had been designed to feed millions. The same industrial capacity that had produced 30,000 tanks and 300,000 aircraft had been redirected toward surplus food distribution. Wheat from Kansas, beef from Texas, canned vegetables from California, all shipped across the Pacific to feed the nation that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The numbers were staggering. By March 1946, American forces were distributing 3.5 million meals per day to Japanese civilians. By year's end, that figure would climb to 5 million. The aid included not just soup kitchens but direct food shipments, agricultural reform programs, and medical supplies. Japan, which had been told for a decade that America's wealth was a symptom of spiritual emptiness, was now kept alive by that wealth. For many Japanese civilians, this contradiction could not be processed through existing frameworks. The propaganda had portrayed a binary: material prosperity or moral integrity, Western decadence or Eastern purity. But here was a third option, one that broke the equation: a nation that was both wealthy and willing to share that wealth with its defeated enemy. A schoolteacher in Tokyo, Yamamoto Keiko, wrote in her diary, "We were told the Americans would treat us as we treated the Chinese, as we treated the Koreans. We were told to expect revenge. Instead, they give us bread. I do not understand this. My students ask me to explain it, and I have no answer. How do you explain mercy from those you were taught to see as demons?" The symbolic power of the soup line extended beyond nutrition. In Japanese culture, the act of sharing food carried profound social meaning. It implied relationship, obligation, the acceptance of another into one's circle of care. To feed someone was to acknowledge their humanity. For years, Japanese civilians had been asked to sacrifice food for the military, to accept privation as patriotic duty. Children donated their lunch to soldiers. Families melted cooking pots to make bullets. The message had been clear: the individual's hunger was irrelevant compared to the nation's need. Now the occupiers were feeding them. Not because it served a military purpose, the war was over, but because starvation was deemed unacceptable. This inversion of expectations carried a subversive implication. Perhaps individual suffering did matter. Perhaps the preservation of life, even enemy life, was a value worth prioritizing. This realization came slowly, unevenly, wrapped in shame and confusion. Many Japanese struggled to accept the soup without feeling they betrayed the dead. Others rationalized it as pragmatic survival. Japan had lost. This was simply the price of defeat. But for some, particularly the young, the soup lines became evidence of a different world order, one where prosperity and decency were not mutually exclusive. A teenage boy, Sato Masaru, stood in line with his mother in Osaka. He had spent the war years in youth militia training, learning to charge with sharpened bamboo, memorizing slogans about choosing death over dishonor. He had genuinely believed Japan would fight to the last child if necessary. That invasion would mean a glorious apocalypse. Instead, here he was, holding an American bowl, eating American stew, while his former enemy handed out cigarettes and chewing gum to the children. "Why are they doing this?" he asked his mother. She had no answer. She was busy eating, tears running down her face, the first adequate meal she'd had in 8 months. Masaru watched the soldiers. They looked tired and bored, going through the motions of serving. One was singing under his breath, some jazz tune Masaru didn't recognize. Another was showing a photograph to his companion, probably a girl back home. They were not monsters. They were not even particularly impressive. They were simply men doing a job that included feeding their enemies' children. This ordinariness was, in its way, the most radical revelation. The Japanese propaganda had required Americans to be either inferior or monstrous to justify the war. But these men were neither. They were competent, casual, and equipped with so much surplus material that they could afford generosity. The Americans hadn't won because they were spiritually pure or racially superior. They had won because they had more. More steel, more food, more oil, more of everything. And crucially, they had built systems that could mobilize that abundance not just for destruction but for reconstruction. For a boy raised on the rhetoric of spiritual superiority compensating for material disadvantage, this was a conceptual earthquake. If wealth and goodness could coexist, if American plenty didn't preclude American mercy, then what had the war been for? What had his older brother died for, starving in a jungle because the supply ships never came? Masaru didn't articulate these questions yet. He was only 15, and the shape of the new world was still forming. But standing in that line, holding that bowl, he felt the first tremor of a thought that would define his generation. Perhaps Japan had been wrong. Not just about the war, but about the fundamental nature of power and civilization. The soup itself became a recurring symbol in post-war Japanese memory. Unlike rice, the sacred grain, the foundation of Japanese identity, the American soup was explicitly foreign, a daily reminder of dependence and defeat. But it was also undeniably nourishing, often delicious, and served without conditions. This paradox embedded itself in the national consciousness. Writers in the 1950s would recall the occupation soup as a bitter gift, a humiliation, and a salvation. Artists depicted the steam rising from the vats as both fog obscuring Japan's past and warmth sustaining its future. The soup represented everything the Japanese were supposed to reject: foreign influence, material dependence, the abandonment of self-sufficiency, and yet it had kept them alive when their own government could not. One particularly haunting account came from a woman named Kobayashi Fumiko, a nurse who had worked through the final year of the war. She described going to a soup line in Nagasaki, in the shadow of the ruined Mitsubishi factory. "I had spent 2 years treating soldiers who died of preventable diseases because we had no medicine," she wrote. "I had closed the eyes of boys who starved while guarding supplies that never arrived. I had listened to commanders explain that suffering built character, that privation was the Japanese way. Then I stood in line and an American boy, no older than the soldiers I'd watched die, gave me a bowl of stew thick with meat and vegetables. He smiled. He said, 'Ma'am.' I walked away and vomited, not from the food but from the realization that my country had starved its people for an ideology while the enemy had food to waste on mercy." This testimony, published in a memoir years later, captured the cognitive rupture experienced by many Japanese civilians. The soup lines forced a reckoning not just with military defeat but with the lie that had justified the war, that material poverty was a price worth paying for spiritual purity, that Japan's lack of resources was a test of national character rather than a strategic catastrophe. By summer 1946, the soup lines had become a fixture of occupied Japan. They appeared in every major city, operated with American efficiency, and fed millions. But their impact extended beyond nutrition. They became spaces of social reorganization, places where the old hierarchies temporarily dissolved. In the line, former officers stood beside factory workers. Wealthy families who had lost everything waited with farmers and fishermen. The war had preached a rigid social order, loyalty to the emperor, respect for rank, the subordination of individual need to collective duty. The soup line acknowledged only hunger. It was, in a strange way, the most democratic institution many Japanese had encountered. This accidental egalitarianism did not go unnoticed by American observers. A report from a civil affairs officer noted, "The feeding stations have become more than relief centers. They function as informal community hubs where Japanese civilians interact with occupation forces in non-coercive contexts. We observe Japanese citizens helping to distribute food, organize queues, and translate. There is a tentative cooperation emerging, born not from imposed policy but from shared participation in a practical task." The officer's observation hinted at something the architects of occupation had perhaps not fully anticipated: that democracy could be taught not through lectures but through experience. The soup line modeled a kind of social contract, resources distributed based on need, not status, authority exercised through service, not domination. For a population raised under an ideology that celebrated hierarchy and sacrifice, this was a quiet revolution. Not everyone accepted it. There were those who refused the soup, who saw accepting American charity as a betrayal of national pride. Elderly samurai descendants, military officers who had survived the war, intellectuals who clung to the pre-war certainties. Many chose hunger over submission. They walked past the steam and the smell, heads high, sustained by rage and memory. But they were the minority. Most people ate. And in eating, they made a choice, even if they didn't consciously frame it as such. They chose survival over symbolism, pragmatism over purity. They chose, in the most literal sense, to swallow their pride. The transformation this wrought on Japanese society cannot be overstated. Within a generation, Japan would rebuild itself as an economic powerhouse, a democracy, an ally of the very nation that had bombed it into submission. That transformation had many causes: the Zaibatsu reforms, the new constitution, Cold War geopolitics, Japanese work ethic and innovation. But it also had a psychological foundation laid in those early post-war months, when millions of Japanese discovered that the enemy's system could provide what their own could not. The soup became a ghost that haunted Japanese conservatism. Every argument for returning to traditional values, every call to reject Western influence, had to contend with the memory of that winter when the West had fed Japan and Japan's own ideology had starved it. The soup was proof, unwelcome, undeniable, that the wartime narrative had been a lie. America was not weak. American abundance was not moral decay. And perhaps most troublingly, American victory had not required cruelty. This last point was crucial. Japanese civilians had been prepared for vindictive occupation, for the kind of brutal subjugation Japan itself had imposed on Manchuria, Korea, the Philippines. The fact that such brutality did not materialize, that the occupation included food aid, democratic reforms, and economic assistance, created a cognitive dissonance that reshaped Japanese political culture. It became difficult to sustain the narrative of Western barbarism when the barbarians were feeding your children. Of course, the occupation was not without its cruelties, its failures, its contradictions. There were incidents of assault, cultural insensitivity, the imposition of alien values. But the soup lines remained, a daily counterargument to resentment, a material reason to cooperate with the occupation rather than resist it. A journalist, Tanizaki Junichiro, wrote in 1947, "We are a defeated people learning to eat our defeat. It tastes of foreign spices and unfamiliar kindness. Some say it poisons our essence. Others say it keeps us alive. Both are correct. We are being transformed by this nourishment, cell by cell, into something new. Neither the empire we were nor the enemy we fought, but a hybrid nation born from the rubble and the soup pot." The children who grew up eating American soup became the architects of modern Japan. They entered adulthood having internalized a lesson their parents' generation struggled to accept: that prosperity was not shameful, that learning from the enemy was not betrayal, that Japan could change fundamentally and still be Japan. These children, the soup line generation, became salarymen and engineers, teachers and politicians. They rebuilt factories along American models of efficiency. They absorbed American management techniques, American consumer culture, American jazz and baseball. They did so without the paralyzing shame that burdened their elders, because their first memory of America was not bombs but bread. This cultural shift was not uniform or uncontested. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, Japan wrestled with its identity: traditional versus modern, Eastern versus Western, pacifism versus remilitarization. But underlying these debates was a shared foundation: the recognition that Japan's wartime ideology had failed catastrophically, and that the American model, for all its flaws, had demonstrably succeeded. The soup, in this context, was the original evidence. It was the first proof that American power included generosity, that the occupation aimed at reconstruction rather than revenge. Every subsequent Japanese interaction with American culture, every Hollywood film, every rock and roll record, every economic partnership, was filtered through that initial experience of unexpected mercy. By 1952, when the occupation formally ended, the soup lines had long since closed. Japan's economy was recovering, agricultural production had stabilized, and the need for mass food aid had passed. But the memory remained, preserved in diaries and memoirs, photographs and government records. The soup lines became part of the national story, a chapter that explained how a militaristic empire became a pacifist democracy, how bitter enemies became allies. In the decades that followed, as Japan rose to become the world's second-largest economy, the soup lines were rarely discussed in public. They were embarrassing, a reminder of weakness and dependence. Politicians preferred narratives of Japanese resilience, of pulling oneself up through hard work and innovation. American aid was acknowledged, if at all, as a minor footnote. But in private, in family histories, the soup was remembered. Grandparents told grandchildren about the taste of that first American stew, about the shock of kindness when cruelty was expected. These stories conveyed a lesson that official histories could not, that ideologies fail, that systems matter more than slogans, and that sometimes survival requires accepting help from those you were taught to hate. A scholar, examining post-war Japanese literature in the 1980s, noted the recurring motif of soup, stew, and foreign food in novels and memoirs. It appears, she wrote, as a symbol of transformation, the point at which characters abandon old certainties and embrace ambiguous new truths. To eat the enemy's soup is to begin the process of becoming something other than what you were. The Japanese post-war identity was, in a sense, simmered in those American pots. There is a photograph from March 1946, taken at a soup line in Tokyo. It shows an elderly woman receiving a bowl from a young American soldier. The woman's face is partially obscured by a scarf, but her hands are visible, gnarled, work-worn, trembling slightly as they accept the bowl. The soldier is in profile, looking down at his task, professional and detached. Between them, the bowl, simple, utilitarian, filled with steam. This photograph circulated in American newspapers as propaganda, proof of the occupation's humanitarian mission. But in Japan, the image took on a different resonance. The woman became a symbol of the nation itself, elderly, proud, wounded, and forced to accept sustenance from a former enemy. The soldier represented not cruelty but indifference, the banal efficiency of a system so wealthy it could afford compassion. What the photograph captured, and what millions of Japanese experienced in those soup lines, was the collapse of the binary worldview the war had required. The Americans were not demons, but neither were they saviors. They were victors distributing surplus, pragmatists stabilizing a conquered territory, a nation extending its values through the most basic act of feeding the hungry. They were, in short, exactly what Japanese propaganda had said they weren't, a powerful civilization that had integrated material abundance with functional democracy. This revelation, that wealth and morality could coexist, that American plenty was not proof of American decadence, undermined the ideological foundation of Japanese militarism. If the Americans could be both rich and decent, then Japan's poverty had not been a virtue but a failure. The sacrifices demanded by the empire, the starvation rations, the kamikaze missions, the expectation that civilians would die rather than surrender, had not been noble but futile. For some, this realization brought liberation. For others, it brought despair. Many Japanese struggled for years to reconcile their wartime beliefs with the post-war reality. Some never did, carrying their bitterness to the grave. But the next generation, the children of the soup lines, were spared this burden. They grew up in a Japan that had accepted its defeat and been transformed by it, a Japan that had learned to eat from the enemy's bowl and, in doing so, had chosen a different future. In the end, the soup lines were not about soup. They were about the power of systems over slogans, the triumph of logistics over ideology. They were about the discovery that America's strength lay not in spiritual purity or racial superiority, the metrics by which Japan had measured itself, but in industrial capacity and institutional design. The United States won the war not because its soldiers were more willing to die, but because its economy was more capable of producing, and its democracy was more resilient under pressure. This truth, delivered daily in bowls of stew, reshaped Japanese consciousness. It made possible the post-war alliance, the economic partnership, the cultural exchange. It allowed Japan to adopt American models without feeling it had betrayed its essence, because the adoption began not as ideology but as survival. The soup was the first lesson in a long education. It taught that accepting help was not weakness, that learning from the enemy was wisdom, that transformation was possible without annihilation. These lessons took root in the rubble of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the ruins of Tokyo and Osaka, in every city where steam rose from American pots and hungry people lined up to be fed. Years later, when Japan had rebuilt, when its cars and electronics dominated global markets, when its cities gleamed with neon and prosperity, few spoke of the soup lines. They were a memory from a desperate time, a chapter best left closed. But the legacy remained, woven into the fabric of modern Japan, a nation that had learned, in its darkest hour, that pride could be swallowed, that enemies could be teachers, and that sometimes the path to renewal began with a simple bowl of soup, handed across a divide of language and history by someone who, against all propaganda, proved to be human after all. The steam from those American pots rose into the cold February air and dissipated, but it left something behind. The understanding that civilization was not measured by the willingness to suffer but by the capacity to prevent suffering, that greatness was not proven through sacrifice but through surplus, and that a nation strong enough to feed its enemy was a nation guided by a different kind of power, one that did not demand worship but earned respect, one bowl at a time, in the long winter of defeat. This was what the Japanese civilians discovered in those soup lines, and this was what they never forgot. That abundance, wielded with even imperfect mercy, could do what bombs alone could not. It could change minds, soften hearts, and plant the seeds of a peace that would endure long after the steam had faded and the pots were packed away. In the end, the Americans conquered Japan not with fire but with soup, not with ideology but with the quiet, undeniable proof that their system worked better. And Japan, eating that soup, eating its pride, eating its way toward a new identity, learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes being wrong is the beginning of wisdom, and sometimes defeat is the first step toward becoming something greater than victory would have allowed. The bowls were washed and stacked. The kitchens were dismantled. The soldiers went home. But the soup remained, simmering in memory, a reminder that history turns not just on grand battles and noble speeches but on small mercies, unexpected kindnesses, and the stubborn human need to eat, to survive, and to find meaning in the wreckage of everything once believed to be eternal.